I'm not actually a sculptor, although I did study sculpture. I'm also not a filmmaker, I'm not a photographer, I'm not a theorist, and I'm not a lecturer. And it's a series of these knots that really excite the practice that I do. And it's really the basis for the idea that I want to share with you today. I suppose that a large part of the idea relies on my practice as an artist, but also as a lecturer. I supervise master's students who work in a fine arts department. They work in fine arts, but because it's a master's degree, they have to do research. They have to engage with theory. So what I'm talking about is something that's called practice-led research. It's about engaging with ideas and theory in a way that is much more lived, much more embodied. It's about doing things, producing objects, as well as engaging with the ideas that lie behind them. And this is a really important thing because it's about research and it's about art, but it actually goes beyond both of them. So it's not interdisciplinarity at this point, it's a kind of transdisciplinarity. It goes beyond the confines of both research and art and tries to truly innovate. The first project I want to talk to you about that engages with this idea of practice-led research or pushes the boundaries of research and art relies on a highway. It's the double-decker highway that sits on the western side of Johannesburg. It's called the M1, it's called the De Villiers-Graaf motorway. And above Newtown, it becomes a double-decker. This highway has a history for me. It's something that I skated on or around or underneath when I was a kid. We'd climb on top of it and look at the sunsets on the city. And the highway was always there. It was there as a shelter, it was there as a skating prop, but it was never there in an obvious way. We never really noticed it. It was just something we took for granted. I went away to study after high school, and I came back and I started to notice the highway in a much more obvious way. It started to become something that was much more iconic and started to represent Johannesburg in a way that I didn't think of it before, and I suppose I had to leave Johannesburg to find that out. I started to think about the highway as iconic and representative of Johannesburg, but not in a literal way, not in an obvious way. So not like Ponty or the Brixton or Hillbrow Towers stand as icons for Johannesburg. It was iconic in a much more integral way. The iconicity of the highway, of the flyover, related to the way in which we use the city, the way we think about the city. In many cases, it relates to the way that we bypass the city from the south to the north, or vice versa. It is a flyover, so that you don't engage with Johannesburg. So, in trying to kind of explore the ideas around this flyover, I started to think about the concept of an ethnography, which is something that anthropologists use normally to look at people. And I decided to look at the highway through a similar filter. It's not a strange thing to look at an inanimate object through an ethnography, architectural features or engineering features, so it wasn't that strange. What we did though was, and I enlisted the help of two friends of mine, Jonathan Kane, who's a designer, among other things, and Eugene Aris, who's a photographer. The three of us decided to look at the highway in an aesthetic way. So what does the aesthetic lived experience of this highway tell us about its function? And in doing this, we created an installation, an art installation that really looked at how to explore this highway. So we looked at the site, or the highway as a cultural object, really along three narrative ways. So we looked at the people who work on the highway, so the native informants, the guys, and that's an anthropological term. We looked at the guys who work on the highway, the guys who paint the street markings, the engineers who maintain it, as well as a whole range of other people, especially the tow truck drivers who rescue dead bodies and cars from the highway. And they had an experience of the highway that was very particular. We also looked at theorists, so people who had a very abstract relationship to the highway. These guys were theorizing about the highway on a meta level. They were talking about really kind of advanced concepts such as embodied experience and how engineering or architecture starts to influence the way people live. what was really amazing was meeting a whole range of people who live underneath the highway. There's a squatter camp on the northern side of the flyover, and these people have a completely, radically different experience of the highway. The highway for them is a roof. The problems with the highway is about fixing the places it leaks, about making it safer to live in. So all of these experiences really start to change the way that we had approached the highway, and especially myself, where the highway was some kind of a skate park toy. And we decided to make an installation out of it. So the installation worked across many televisions with photographs and a painting, and really asked the viewer to look at the highway, look closely at it. Very consciously, we avoided posing solutions to what this thing proposes. The idea of having the questions that are appropriate to any kind of process is also problematic, because as soon as you decide on what the questions are, your answers are kind of limited. Your question could be wrong. So this relates back to the idea of practice-led research, in that your research process needs to be vital, needs to have a reflexivity in it and a spontaneity in it that allows you to change its direction. If that doesn't happen, the idea of any kind of innovation becomes very difficult. Okay, the next project that I want to show you is one that I did in Durban earlier this year around the World Cup. This project was around a media residency which aimed to question the idea of large-scale sporting spectacles, especially in their relationship to public space. So what I decided to do, I mean, even before going to Durban, I really knew I wanted to work with the taxi drivers, who I know in Durban modify their taxis in really crazy ways. They really soup them up in ways that are quite amazing. I found a guy called Mark Chinsami, who drives a taxi called Dollarlicious. Mark is an owner-driver, so he doesn't work for a boss. He drives his own taxi. And Mark and I spent a couple of days working together. I was filming him, and I was going to make a documentary film, well, a slightly more arty documentary film, because my documentary filmmaker friends tell me I'm not a documentary filmmaker. But Mark and I spent a long time together. It turned out Mark and I are from the same place in Durban, and he ended up confiding in me probably more than he would have, at least more than he would have to a camera. How did Mark understand the dynamics of a camera? I'm not sure. Did Mark understand the dynamics of the audience that I would show the film to, the KZNSA, which is a gallery in Durban? Well, he'd never been there, so he probably didn't understand any of that. So the idea of what Mark was speaking to, well, he was speaking to me, that was obvious, but did he understand the processes of representation which would just kind of carry out this footage, this documentary that I made of him? I mean, living up to the stereotypes of taxi driver, Mark started to confide in me things that were less savory, perhaps illegal, really kind of playing into the stereotype of the gangster taxi driver. I mean, at this point, I had a kind of ethical dilemma. I mean, I'm not an investigative journalist. I do not work for Carte Blanche. I'm not Deborah Patter either, so I'm not going to try and have an expose of the taxi driver as this, I mean, and really just repeating stereotypes. So what I did was rather simple. I invited Mark to the gallery to engage in a conversation. So we stood in front of an audience, and we discussed why he did all of these things to his taxi, why he put these decals on, why the 1,000-watt sound system, why modify like this. So Mark was there, the taxi was there, people engaged with the taxi, and we really had a conversation. The idea of this conversation was quite scary because it was not planned, it wasn't rehearsed, so the control that I normally have was not there, that I normally have in the edit suite, where you control down to a frame. That opening up of the project for me was something really amazing because it really provided a vitality that really questioned the idea that I started out with in the beginning. The idea of the taxi as a modified vehicle, as something that is personalized, is an idea that is probably useless to city planners. What would a city planner do with this kind of idea? I mean, and this is where the idea of research needs to become much more sensitive to this chaos, to this idea of trying to understand or work with those things that we really don't understand. If you have to look at the aesthetic dimensions of the taxi industry, you'd perhaps come out with some kind of a web diagram, because that's a polite way to describe how taxi drivers drive. It's definitely not linear. In that sense, if you have to take the aesthetic on board, you probably wouldn't try and linearize the roads in Johannesburg more with rear vias, because that would be a shape, a form that's not appropriate to taxis. You'd probably say, let's encourage that web-like structure, but maybe the problem is the speed. So maybe we put speed bumps in to regulate the flow of traffic. But the idea of going and asking questions of people, of phenomena, of things in the world, is something that's really underutilized in any kind of research or any kind of innovation process. The idea that we know the questions that are appropriate is something that can really kill you in advance. I mean, ultimately, what I'm engaged with is a form of art making that tries to become more reflexive of the outside world. I'm situated somewhere between a documentary filmmaker, a theorist, and a fine artist. So there's a real kind of disciplinary breakdown, if you want, where at least the university kind of struggles to kind of accept my funding proposals when I send it to them, because they always say, well, that's the other department. And the same goes with museums and galleries. So the idea of the institutional networks that support or don't support this is also really important to think about. I mean, certainly for my students, the idea of doing theoretical work on top of a practical body of work. I mean, I'm working with sculptors and painters and video artists. Theory becomes something that's slapped on retroactively to a painting, which is not a very good idea at any point, because you want a theoretical framework or a research process that's actually integral to your artistic process. And in the same way, you want a research process that takes on board some of the more spontaneous and intuitive ideas that come from art. So, thanks and bye.